Hello. Please hit like button and subscribe my channel. Also press bell icon for future video notifications. Thanks.
The primitive streak, a structure that emerges in mammalian and avian embryos to help assign spatial information to cells during early development, has long been regarded as essential for the genesis of an organism's body plan and individuality, and was thus used as a landmark in ethical guidelines for. But a new literature review pulls together evidence from stem cell research, evolutionary history papers, and developmental biology studies to make the argument that the primitive streak may not be so necessary after all. In doing so, the review, which was published today, December 2, in Science, challenges century-old assumptions that scientists have been making regarding how an embryo changes from a collection of identical cells into an organism with a distinct, asymmetric form. He adds that he found the review refreshing, for its ability to start new discussions about embryonic development and challenge dogmatic thinking that has dictated the conversation for years. The review's conclusion that the streak isn't essential, if further supported, could provide the impetus to change the way stem cell and embryonic research experiments are regulated. While the International Society for Stem Cell Research, ISSCR, relaxed the rule in May 2021, allowing experiments to continue longer on a case-by-case basis, a 2-week timeframe is still the widely accepted norm. If that were to change as a result of the paper, it could result in a profound change in biomedical research, Fu says. This will open the door for continuous progress to use human stem cells to generate human embryo models, he adds. Cells that will eventually end up as part of an animal's head, back, and spine, assuming the animal in question has them, differentiate during this process. At the beginning of gastrulation, a furrowlike structure appears in the embryos of birds, and nearly all mammals, monotremes, which include platypuses and echidnas, are likely excluded. However, the review makes the argument that the primitive streak is a byproduct of the gastrulation process, not the shepherd of epithelial cell allocation and. Or is it just a convenient way to get the cells from one place to another, and that final destination is where they're going to differentiate and create new tissue shapes? That's the crux of the review's controversial prediction, that the primitive streak is a useful evolutionary trick, but not a. The review's authors cite the fact that many branches of the animal kingdom don't seem to develop a primitive streak, and the fact that mammals and birds evolved to have primitive streaks independently of one another, as evidence of the structure's arbitrariness. Most people in the field recognize that the 14-day rule was somewhat an arbitrary cutoff. For the rest, he says, the primitive streak was already known to be irrelevant. So, if you're talking about differentiation into dermal layers, it's clear you don't need any sort of organized structure, such as the primitive streak, Warmflash says, adding that the primitive streak does seem to be necessary for establishing spatial structure in the embryo. But that doesn't end. Whether those processes could be decoupled in embryos that have a primitive streak is not totally clear. The review also points to experimental evidence, including studies from Warmflash's lab and work done by the review's co-authors, from in vitro pluripotent models using human and mouse stem cells. The trick to getting cells to differentiate into tissue resembling the very orderly embryo rather than a nondescript mass was to physically restrict the ways in which cells could grow. Sutherland says that while these stem cell models have been inconsistent and that questions remain, her interpretation of their evidence to date is that the primitive streak isn't a structure that forms in order to drive gastrulation. Rather, it is something that appears based on physical and mechanical constraints imposed on the embryo. Extending the argument further, the review suggests that the primitive streak appears or doesn't appear in certain species due to those factors, and is therefore not a developmental necessity. We suggest that all embryos acquire a midline very early on that will organize the emerging cell types and that the primitive streak is a mechanical response of the cells along this line created by the interactions of the embryo with the extraembryonic tissues. Review co-author Alfonso Martinez AR. Or is it just a convenient way to get the cells from one place to another? If scientists could demonstrate proper development of germ layers without development of the primitive streak, in a stem cell model, that would serve as definitive proof of the review's predictions, says Fu. But that's easier said than done. Recapitulating a human gastrula embryo in vitro is a sort of holy grail for many. Review co-author and Kumamoto University developmental geneticist Gojun Sheng tells the scientist in an email. He adds that successfully doing so would enable researchers to induce better integrated tissues and organs in their in vitro models. So whether our prediction is correct or not will become evident if stem cell biologists can, or cannot, achieve that. Where to draw the line, it's not clear what impact the review's conclusions may have on stem cell regulation, but experts tell the scientist that the review helps point out that every researcher who spoke to the scientist about the new review paper agrees that the ISSCR's updated guidelines are a step in the right direction, and that the original usage of the primitive streak as the basis for the 14-day rule was capricious. Most people in the field recognize that the 14-day rule was somewhat an arbitrary cutoff, Warmflash says. At the time it was established, scientists didn't worry that much about it. In terms of research, we were nowhere close to being able to culture embryos past 14 days or to being able to recapitulate these stem cells. Regulators pushed forward with it because the emergence of the primitive streak was thought to represent the emergence of human individuality, after which it. However, the review's prediction that the primitive streak isn't necessary makes it an unreliable ethical red line, Sutherland says. But both say that the answer needs to come from bigger conversations among more diverse communities, including researchers, bioethicists, regulatory agencies, and an engaged public. I think, at this point, we really have to think carefully about which ones of those are the best ones to use, Sutherland says. I myself don't feel qualified to make a strong decision or a strong recommendation, because there are a lot of things to think about. Quote, please support my channel to grow by pressing subscribe button and the bell icon. We will notify you technological news. Thank you.